Um, in the last couple of minutes, I want to broaden out a little bit. I mean, I'll say this. I've said this a bunch of times. Like for a long time, when it came to environmental politics, just being a good lefty, I was like, well, I'll just support the people who have good environmental politics. I didn't really think about it too much. Just put my cards on the table. But then I've started to realize over time that, there's actually going to be a lot of policy on this, and it's going to start to matter as to what happens. And it's worthwhile paying attention to. We have to go beyond just being like, oh, we believe in the science, but starting to recognize that, there are very different worlds that are possible coming out of this transition. Um,
Definitely.
and one of the things about the IRA that I've been sort of worried about, where it's like I welcome, some of the provisions. When I hear everyone saying this is the biggest climate legislation that's ever been passed, you think about the scale, the scope, the fights that went into it. I mean, how do you think that this is going to sort of affect the kind of climate movement in this country? Do you think there's some people who might start feeling, oh man, well, we got this done. I'm still going to care about this a bit, but it's time to move on to maybe something else. Or people might be disappointed by it and start to feel like politics isn't really the answer for doing things like this. I mean, you've been covering and involved in a lot of these things for a long time, so I'm just curious what your sense and take of the effect broadly.
I mean, I think we're going to definitely see both of those things. I think we're seeing lots and lots of celebration of this bill. We're also seeing, again, like quite a bit of disappointment with this bill that I think is leaving some people disillusioned. And I'll be really interested, frankly, to see like where the sort of broader climate movement, how they respond to this, and then also how it sort of fractures in response to this. The permitting deal, I think, is a really great example where like on the one hand, you're totally right that we need more sort of permitting reform. We need, like, it's pretty clear, more transmission lines and things like this. And I think that there's been quite a bit of focus on like that in the abstract instead of actually
Hmm.
looking at the policy itself. And I think that if this has taught us anything, it's that, looking at like the demands that we have in the abstract doesn't really make very much sense when what you're talking about is like real politics that has real consequences for real people. And when the people who are sort of, in charge of deciding what our future looks like are not generally motivated by, or at least not solely motivated by the like fight for a survivable future, but instead motivated by also like, I think fair to maybe assume like the people who are maybe funding their campaigns and things like this. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, like I think it's totally reasonable that people are celebrating this as a victory, and I think that would not have been sort of possible if it were not for things like the huge movement for a Green New Deal that we've seen over the past few years. On the other hand, I think it's really important to be sort of realistic and like highlight the massive differences between what those demands looked like, five, the two, even like just a year ago, and what actually is in the text of the bill. The other thing that I'll say is like, I think anytime that there's a big policy like this, there's a real danger of looking at just the text of the policy and not seeing how it's actually implemented. So like the big flashy moment, right, is the moment that Biden signs a bill, the moment that you get the votes or whatever. But there are, in some ways the IRA raises as many questions as it answers, like how is it actually going to play out when the way that people have to when the way that people get their like incentives for their electric vehicles changes? How is it going to play out when there's like new kind of tax incentives for firms to use solar energy and things like this? Who's going to be left out of that? Who's going to stand to benefit the most from that? What companies are going to benefit the most from that? What individuals? So I think this is like only the very, very beginning of the story. And I think as we see that implementation process, I think there's going to be a lot of probably some more, unfortunately, fracturing happening along the way.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a rough moment because I think it's also worth reminding folks that while we definitely need more renewables, we have to think about the way that they're structured. I mean, here right now there's a lot of fights going on because a lot of the solar and wind jobs aren't good jobs, and they're really taking advantage of people. And I think that this is one of the big differences between maybe like the Bernie Sanders and the more progressive movement, and maybe more, I don't know, more standard Democratic Party voters, is they just see green good, instead of recognizing like these things have real effects on a lot of people's lives,
Absolutely.
and it's important that we reckon with that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, to that point, like we've seen already folks like General Motors, sort of, using the process of transitioning to EVs as sort of a way to say, okay, well, now the remaining jobs left in producing these sort of old school cars are going to go to contract workers. We're not going to give people the
Mhm.
same benefits to work on those and things like this. And I think that watching what, for instance, like the new EV incentive structure, what effects it has on that sort of like labor market and those labor struggles is going to be really important. The text of the bill is only like the very, very first part of the puzzle. It doesn't really tell us very much about what the future will look like.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's going to be interesting to watch. Well, before we let you go, and I apologize because I didn't prep you on this, but I hope that you might be able to speak to this a little bit. You wrote a really great piece a little while ago about King Charles, and if you wanted to, push people to go and click that link and read the piece, I mean, could you just sort of set that up, give people a little pitch to go read that?
Oh, sure. Thank you. King Charles has been sort of lauded for all of his like climate activism and things like this, which is largely focused in two realms. One is like his personal consumption habits, and the other one is trying to push corporations to make like greener investments. Whatever that means, not a ton of accountability in that sphere because it's all like private sector stuff. Um, so, for all of that, he's been lauded as like the new climate king. A lot of people have been really, excited about what that could mean for the sort of climate fight. There's been some fear that he might sort of start being a little bit more measured about his calls for climate action in the future. But in the piece, I took sort of a different look at this, which is, that the history of climate change is pretty deeply interwoven and in some ways is the same history as the history of British imperialism and colonialism. And I think, the idea that a climate king could exist is like pretty strange if you take into account. But if he's serious about sort of taking on like the massive uh, contributions of his nation to climate change, then he has to also be serious about taking on the contributions of his nation to colonialism. I mean, not
Mhm.
contributions to as a driving force of colonialism. And I'm not holding my breath, but I guess we'll see.
Yeah. I like that a guy that doesn't clean his own desk, like has a special person do that. Like his personal consumption habits are going to be impressive. Like, yeah, he has. Well, I don't even know what that means for that guy. He has like a different guy drive him around in a slightly different fancy car that uses electric, batteries. Like,
I'm like,
okay,
no,
cool.
literally, not even electric batteries. Matt, he has a car that runs on the byproducts of wine and cheese, like a biofuel that is made from byproducts of wine and cheese. Yes, this
That's
is the dude
amazing.
who's gonna
That's
live in the
scalable, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, who doesn't have a lot of old wine and cheese sitting around in the cellar? Um,
Oh my gosh.
well, Darna, I really appreciate you taking the time. I couldn't imagine anyone better to help break down all these topics with us.
Thank
People
you.
should definitely be reading Darna's work in the Boston Globe and also following her on Twitter. She is a wonderful follow. I really appreciate it, and we'll definitely have to have you on sooner than later.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really fun to chat.
Thanks, Darna.